the underground parking garage beneath the Laurent International. Tower was almost empty that evening, its polished floor reflecting the harsh white lights above. Several expensive black SUVs stood in a perfect line near the private elevator, while two security guards watched the entrance. Victoria Laurent, a wealthy and powerful billionaire businesswoman in her early 40s, walked quickly toward her armored SUV. She wore an elegant lavender blazer and matching skirt over a white blouse, and despite her calm appearance, irritation was written across her face. Beside her walked her 20-year-old daughter, Emma, a young woman with long brown hair and a light blue sweater. Behind them stood several security men, but the person Victoria was most angry with was the man standing beside the driver's door. Daniel Carter, 38, was a single father and Victoria's personal driver. He wore a dark navy suit, white shirt, and tie, looking unusually serious. Victoria stopped in front of him and said coldly, "You're fired." Daniel didn't react immediately. He simply looked at her, then at Emma. "May I ask why, Ms. Laurent?" Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Because you ignored my instructions this morning. I told you to take the east route, and you took the west route. You made me late for a meeting worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Daniel calmly replied, "The east route was blocked by construction. I checked the traffic feeds before leaving." Victoria shook her head. "I don't pay you to make decisions for me." Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment. "No, ma'am. You pay me to get you and your family where you need to go, safely. And now you're unemployed." Victoria snapped. Emma looked uncomfortable. "Mom, maybe you should—" "Emma, stay out of this," Daniel quietly removed the keys from his pocket and placed them on the hood of the SUV. "Understood." He turned to leave. He had no intention of arguing. Daniel had learned years ago that pride could destroy a man faster than any enemy. He had once served as a Navy SEAL, where hesitation could cost lives, and afterward he had promised himself that he would live quietly and raise his 8-year-old son, Noah. Driving for Victoria had simply been a stable job that allowed him to pay his bills and be home for his son. As Daniel walked away, Emma watched him with a strange feeling. She had always noticed how he checked every door twice, scanned every room before allowing her inside, and positioned himself between her and strangers without making a big show of it. She had assumed he was simply overly cautious. She had never known why. Daniel had barely walked 20 feet when his instincts suddenly changed. He stopped. The sound of tires screeching against the concrete echoed through the garage. He turned his head. At the far entrance, a black SUV came through the security barrier far too quickly. Victoria's security men immediately reached for their radios. Emma looked toward the approaching vehicle, confused. Victoria shouted, "What is happening?" Before anyone could answer, the SUV accelerated directly toward them. Daniel's entire body reacted before his mind could process it. "Emma!" he yelled. He sprinted back. Victoria froze. Emma stood directly in the vehicle's path. Daniel reached her seconds before impact, grabbed her around the waist, and threw both of them sideways behind a concrete pillar. The SUV smashed into a parked vehicle with a deafening crash. Glass exploded across the floor. Victoria screamed her daughter's name. Her security team rushed forward, but Daniel was already moving. He pulled Emma behind him and scanned the garage. "Stay down," he ordered. Emma was shaking violently. "Daniel," she whispered. He looked at her quickly. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. I don't think so." Daniel immediately noticed a second danger. The first SUV had been a distraction. 2 masked men had emerged from behind the vehicles, moving toward Victoria and Emma. Daniel pushed Emma farther behind the pillar. "Don't move." One attacker raised a weapon. Daniel grabbed a fallen metal barrier and used it to block the man's advance, then drove him backward with controlled movements. He wasn't fighting like an ordinary driver. His movements were precise, economical, and practiced. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. Another attacker rushed toward Emma. Daniel intercepted him before he could reach her. Within seconds, the man was on the ground, disarmed and unable to continue. The garage erupted into chaos as Victoria's security team finally recovered and moved against the remaining attackers. Sirens could be heard approaching from above. Emma clung to the pillar, breathing rapidly. Daniel returned to her immediately. "Emma, look at me." She raised her eyes. You're safe. Victoria walked toward them, her face pale. For the first time since Daniel had started working for her, she looked at him without seeing a driver. She saw a man who had placed himself between her daughter and danger, without hesitation. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked at her. "You hired me as a driver." Victoria shook her head. "That's not what I mean." Daniel remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he said, "I served in the United States. Navy, Special Operations." Victoria's eyes widened. "You were a Navy SEAL?" Daniel nodded once. Emma looked at him with astonishment. The man she had watched drive her family around. The city was someone who had spent years training for situations exactly like this. Victoria looked toward the wrecked SUV and then back at Daniel. Her voice became softer. "I just fired you." Daniel glanced at the keys still sitting on the SUV hood. "Yes, ma'am," Victoria swallowed. "And you still saved my daughter?" Daniel answered simply, "I didn't save her. Because you employ me. I saved her because she needed help." Those words hit Victoria harder than the crash itself. Police vehicles soon filled the underground garage, their flashing lights reflecting across the polished floor. Paramedics examined Emma while officers questioned Victoria's security team. The attackers had been restrained, but one of them had escaped during the confusion. Victoria stood near the damaged SUV, still struggling to understand how close she had come to losing her daughter. Emma sat on the hood of another vehicle while a paramedic checked a small cut on her arm. Daniel remained several feet away, speaking quietly with an officer. His calmness was almost unsettling compared with the chaos around him. Victoria approached him after the officer left. "Daniel," he turned. "Yes, ma'am?" Victoria looked uncomfortable. "Stop calling me ma'am." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You're my former employer." She gave him a tired look. "I think we've moved beyond that." Daniel said nothing. Victoria looked at his hands. There was a small cut across his knuckles from the confrontation. "You were trained for this." "Yes." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Daniel looked toward Emma. "Because you hired a driver." "Not a bodyguard," Victoria sighed. "I treated you unfairly." Daniel didn't argue. "You were angry." "I was arrogant," Victoria corrected. "There's a difference." Daniel gave a faint smile. "At least you admit it." For the first time, Victoria almost smiled herself. Then her expression became serious. "Why would someone attack my daughter?" Daniel looked toward the entrance. "I don't know yet, but I don't think the driver firing had anything to do with what happened." "Today," Victoria frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel explained that the attackers had used professional timing. The first vehicle had created panic, while the second group moved in from another direction. They weren't simply trying to scare Victoria. They were trying to reach Emma. Victoria's face went pale. "Why Emma?" Daniel looked at her carefully. "That's what we need to find out." Emma approached them, still shaken. "Mom?" Victoria turned. "Are you okay?" Emma nodded. Then she looked at Daniel. "You saved me," Daniel replied. "Anyone would have done the same." Emma shook her head. "No, they wouldn't." Daniel didn't know how to respond. Emma continued, "Well, when everyone froze, you didn't." He looked away for a moment. "That's what I was trained to do." Victoria watched the exchange quietly. She had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from her. Business partners wanted contracts, investors wanted profits, and employees wanted promotions. Daniel had been different. He had never asked for anything. Even after being fired, he had risked his life for her daughter. Suddenly, Victoria understood that the most valuable person in her security team had never actually been on her security team. Later that night, Daniel received a phone call from his son, Noah. "Dad, are you coming home?" Daniel smiled immediately. "Of course, buddy. I'll be home soon." Victoria heard the child's voice and realized something she had never considered. Daniel wasn't just a former soldier. He was a father who had responsibilities waiting for him at home. When the call ended, Victoria said, "Your son?" Daniel nodded. 8 years old. "Does he know what happened?" "Not yet." Victoria hesitated. "You should go to him." Daniel looked toward Emma. "I'll leave once I know she's safe." Victoria shook her head. "I'll make sure she is." Daniel looked at her seriously. That's not enough. Victoria frowned. What do you mean? The people who attacked her may still be out there. He paused. And whoever planned this probably knows your routines. Victoria stared at him. Then what should I do? Daniel looked at her and said, change everything. Routes, schedules, vehicles, security patterns. And don't tell anyone outside your closest circle. Victoria nodded slowly. Will you help me? Daniel looked surprised. I fired you. Victoria gave a small, embarrassed smile. And then you saved my daughter's life. She extended her hand. I would like to hire you again. Not just as a driver. Daniel looked at her hand but didn't take it immediately. I have one condition. Victoria waited. My son comes first. If I need to leave work for him, I leave. Victoria answered without hesitation. Agreed. Daniel finally shook her hand. But before they could say anything else, one of the police officers rushed toward them. Ms. Laurent, we found something. Victoria turned. The officer held up a phone recovered from one of the attackers. There was a message sent 20 minutes before the attack. Victoria's face tightened. What did it say? The officer looked at Daniel, then back at her. It said, the girl is the target. Make sure the former SEAL isn't there. Silence fell over the garage. Victoria slowly looked at Daniel. He understood immediately. This wasn't a random attack. Someone knew who he was. Someone had planned around his presence. Daniel's expression hardened as his old instincts returned. He looked toward the dark entrance of the garage and said quietly, Then this isn't over. Emma stepped closer to her mother. Victoria placed an arm around her daughter. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about her billion-dollar company, her reputation, or her wealth. She was thinking only about keeping her daughter alive. And standing beside them was the man she had fired only minutes before, the single father she had, mistaken for an ordinary driver, unaware that the former Navy SEAL had just become the one person she trusted most.